So we're here at the Bigfoot Discovery Museum with Curator Mike Rugg, and we're going to talk about the possible ability that a Bigfoot tooth was discovered here in Santa Cruz. Now, Mike, go ahead and give us this background story on the tooth itself, please.
Yeah, a man named Matt Bento, he's a veterinary nurse. He works on animals' teeth and other body parts on a daily basis, and he's also a collector of shark's teeth. And so there's sand hills around this area, particularly in Scotts Valley, about 3 miles from here, where there are just literally thousands of shark's teeth. You go over there and every other shovel load you'll find a shark's tooth. So it was early in the spring after a heavy thunderstorm. He figured the big drops would wash away some sand, so he wanted to get out there right away and check for some new discoveries in case some stuff had been unearthed. And he's walking at the base of a hill, and he notices where a swale of water had come down and made a puddle next to the path. And the puddle was dried out at that point. There was no water left in the puddle, just a little mud. And his eye picked up the glimmer of the enamel. He spotted the enamel there, which he's always looking for. And so he reached down and picked it up, and there was 2 pieces. They were just laying there on the ground, but it had washed downhill from higher up. And he looked at him and said, "Wow, this is not a shark's tooth, but this is a pretty interesting looking tooth. This looks like a primate tooth." So anyway, he put it in a box and put it in with his collection. He didn't get too excited about it because, like I say, he was looking for megalodon teeth.
Right. Super secret, ancient dinosaur teeth.
Yeah, he was caught up in the shark thing. So then he happened into the museum one day. And this is the beauty of this museum. This is why I love it so dearly. This museum acts as an attraction, and it brings people in. Not only people who have an interest and want to learn about the subject of Bigfoot, but people that have something to add and something to tell. And so I don't have to trace all over the world chasing people down to interview them. They come right in and there they are. So I just love it. And you never know what's going to come through that door, as they say on TV. So Matt came in. We got to talking. I showed him our sighting map. And we had a sighting in Scotts Valley back in the 80s, not too far from where this tooth was found. So a couple of days later, Matt returns to the museum, and he hands me the tooth and says, "I want to gift this to you in the museum, because this seems to be more up your alley. Maybe you can get something good done with this tooth." So I thanked him, and we had it on display here in the museum for several years. And over the course of time, I showed it to 6 different dentists. These are people who walked in here and in the course of conversation mentioned they were dentists. And I would take the tooth up and show it to them, let them take a close look and examine it. And all 6 of the dentists that I showed it to said that it looked like a human upper molar, but way too big. And that was the phrase, way too big.
And that's the beginning of vetting of the evidence itself. Is one of the things that we've gone through a lot lately. The Dr. Sykes paper was just released here this week.
Oh, was it?
And the hair sample listings of where they actually came from were also released as well. Mm-hmm. And there was actually only 1 hair on the entire list that was primate, which means all of the other samples that were given to him to be tested in this sample basis were not vetted samples, because simply by looking at them under a microscope, whether you can identify what type of hair it is or not, you can tell it's not primate. At least in this case, you showed it to the proper people, like a human dentist that would say, "Hey, this looks a lot like something that could be related to Bigfoot."
Exactly. And it would take only a casual look under a microscope with hairs, because we have samples of Bigfoot hairs for comparison. We have samples of most of the other hairs that are around. Yeah, well, I had my suspicion about that Sykes Project when they did the TV version and they debunked the Yeti as being a bear.
And that's the big release of the white paper now, is the fact that the bear is, possibly this extinct species that's still out there, and they're trying to make a cryptid reach because there is no bear conference circuit to go talk about it.
Well, obviously, from the get-go, they didn't vet the samplings properly, and they took stuff that was not likely to be Bigfoot. They didn't care.
Spent $2,500 worth of DNA testing on each one of those samples just because they could.
Yeah. And there's a discrepancy in what I understand from several scientists, that bear hair shafts can or cannot yield DNA, depending on who you talk to. Melba contended that you have to have a skin tag or a follicle in order to get DNA from, but Sykes claimed differently. I know that Sykes a few years ago announced that he had some DNA he couldn't identify. And so I had heard that eventually he revisited that, and he apparently worked out some kind of workarounds, and he was able to identify it as bear. So when he had the Collateral Hominid Project announced, I figured that what he was doing was going to be to try and test his methodology for distinguishing hairs. And that's why all he tested were hairs. We submitted our tooth to him. He wasn't interested.
And it was specifically put out to the Bigfoot community during that looking for samples, that they were looking specifically for hair samples. So
initially they said samples, period.
Right, initially, you're right, and then they did change it to hair samples.
Well, I heard from Jeff Meldrum. He told me, well, they're only taking, he's the one I heard that from. And that they were being picky about what they took, and that they had virtually nothing from North America. Except they went to meet with Smedja, and they tried to find DNA on his boot. And couldn't.
Well, to be fair on that particular instance, they took less than the size of a half of a dime in excise to actually be tested. So, in the use of the boot and the water that would have washed across it, that particular half of a dime size piece may not have contained DNA.
Which but to say there was none on the boot.
Right, to say that the whole boot doesn't have DNA is
another example of how the project was done in a half-assed
I completely agree.
And that's why it's falling in line with the usual.
So did he return your piece of the tooth that you sampled into him, or does he still have it?
No, I sent a letter to him asking him to, and he has not sent me.
Now, he's not the first person that you gave a piece of the tooth to,
I gave some of the tooth to Melba Ketchum. Actually, that was an interesting process, and that's what got me involved with the DNA thing. I got a call one day from Richard Stubbstad. Richard Stubbstad was an engineer who just recently had gotten interested in the Bigfoot phenomenon. He told me that he was a skeptic, essentially, and then he heard about DNA testing and decided, well, that's right up my line as an engineer, statistical analysis, essentially, and I can get my head on that. So he hooked up with Melba Ketchum and volunteered to help out with the project. For a while, he was her right-hand man. He was the one who contacted me, because I had spoken originally with Melba Ketchum. One day Tom Biscardi came here to talk, nice. And I had a conversation over lunch with Tom Biscardi. He told me then that Melba was going to be testing some of his samples, and that if I had something I might want to jump on the bandwagon. And I told him I have a tooth, so he called her right then on his cell phone and introduced me, and I spoke to Melba, and I told her about the tooth, and I said, she said, well, they would essentially take the tooth and destroy it, and then take what little was left after pulverizing it and test that. But the whole tooth would be lost. And I said, well, that's not good. This is a museum. We want to have at least part of the tooth on hand at all times. So I had not agreed to be part of the project at that point, but I told her I would keep it in mind. Then they came after me. Stubbstead contacts me and says, well, Melba's getting serious about this now. She had a couple of false starts because she was cavalier with the supply. She tested and got positive results, and then she'd thrown out so much of it she didn't have anything else to go back on. So now we're asking for more samples, and that's when the whole thing started. So Paulides was involved at that point too.
So in the initial state, they actually admitted to you that she was cavalier with the samples and came up with false positives.
Well, she admitted that openly. She had positives, and because she had the positives for the first time, she wanted to go back and re-examine now because she had passed the first stage. But she had been cavalier, assuming it wouldn't even pass the first stage, so she had gone ahead and thrown out the sample, and she kicked herself for that. And so then she put a cry out, and Dave Paulides was the first, and then Java Bob via Tom Biscardi got into the ball game as well. Because Java Bob had separated from Tom Biscardi, and he'd gone his own way, And then he and Richard Stubstead got together, and they were going to team up with Melba on the genome project initially, and they had papers going and this and that. And I'm just sitting back saying, saying, well, the bottom line here is we can get the DNA from the right sources to the right person and have it tested properly. We can solve this mystery once and for all. So I was just trying to get that happening.
And unfortunately, so far now, we're into 2 samplings into 2 different DNA geneticists, and unfortunately for us, we don't have any results from that particular tooth from either one of them. Is that correct?
When Stubstead, let me follow through on how the whole thing went down. When Stubstead contacted me, he said, we're interested in your tooth. Would you be willing to let us take a sample of your tooth? And I said, as long as you don't destroy the tooth, I think you ought to be able to open this tooth and take something out of the middle without destroying it. And if you will be willing to do that, then I'll be a part of the project. But I'm not going to just send you the tooth and have you do what you want with it. I'm going to accompany the tooth, or it isn't going anywhere. I knew better than just hand it off.
Right, because scientists don't care what you say.
They end up missing all the time,
right,
these samples they give to scientists. I put it in my drawer and I lost track of it. So I said, if you want the tooth, I go with it. So he said, well, let's look into, maybe we can come up and have a DNA lab up in your neck of the woods take it so you can deliver it to the lab yourself in person. We'll look into it. So I started calling around, and all the DNA labs, when I mentioned Bigfoot, said no way.
Which is the problem that we run into a lot with getting DNA testing. Luckily today we have several well-known geneticists or people who have availability to genetic testing available to us. If we get proper vetted samples, they're at least willing to get them into the game for us.
Well, I have to say, right now, I'm pretty unhappy with DNA scientists.
I don't blame you
because
whatsoever.
They've got me very confused.
Yeah.
If they can't agree on things, this should be a slam dunk. I mean, when Sykes entered the project, he said this will be a slam dunk, the evidence will speak for itself. Well, yeah, except that you interpreted the evidence by the way you presented it. If you go to Nepal and you hire a Sherpa to guide you around, chances are you're looking for some Yeti evidence. You're looking to see a Yeti. So now if you, with your guide, happen to come across some tracks on the side of a mountain, what do you think the Sherpa is going to tell you those tracks are from?
Right.
A Yeti, not a bear.
Right.
But the tracks are probably 9 times out of 10 from a bear. But it's the economy there, and that's how those people live. So they want to give you as much Yeti as you want to take.
It's the initial agenda that usually fits the findings that are reported.
And just because the samples that they tested weren't properly vetted and should have been thrown out initially to begin with, doesn't prove that the Yeti's a bear. It just proves that they didn't have any Yeti samples.
And it also proves that he got extremely lucky, because even without this ancient bear DNA in his study whatsoever, his study has bupkis. 0. Squat.
Did you see the picture of that bear?
I did, and it's quite interesting.
Did you notice how it looks like the whole nose has been flattened?
And it stands longer in the body and kind of stands up almost on 2 feet, possibly a lot.
It's almost like a Fiji mermaid, where they just altered the face a little bit so it didn't look so much like a bear.
Yeah, and it's getting to the point that they're just creating science for something to do, is what it seems. Dr. Sykes needs something to do in his retirement, and this archaic bear now is going to be his cryptid
I had
search.
high hopes that Sykes might be high enough in the hierarchy to where he doesn't have to prove anything to anybody, and he doesn't have to go along with the party line, but apparently not.
And one important thing to note about the Sykes study as well, and Dr. Sykes has yet, and Strella probably will not, ever come out and support Dr. Ketchum's findings in her DNA. He's yet to come out and say that she's right, or he wouldn't have been bothering in the first place.
Well, so far I've seen a couple of different scientists' opinions on this, and of course they vary.
That's it, and it's going to take...
I've seen some that say this wasn't so bad what she did. Maybe her conclusions are premature, but the science seems okay. And then I have others who say, no, it's all bogus. So, see, I don't trust DNA scientists, and I don't know how to judge them.
I'm exactly there.
And so if I choose right now, if I had $10,000 to put into having this tooth tested, which it would cost at least, because I'm not going to settle for only mitochondrial testing.
Right, you want the full
We can do the mitochondria, and probably like every other time, this will come out human.
Okay, now let's keep track of all of it in together here. Now, the sample that you sent to Dr. Ketchum never did get tested, correct?
Right.
And she is still in possession of it, correct?
Yes. Substad had me flown to Los Angeles. He picked me up at the airport. He took me to his dentist, who was retired. His dentist did the work on the tooth in the dental lab under sterile conditions. You know, it's no clean room, but it's the best we could do.
Right.
He was told by Melba how to sanitize the sample to get rid of some of the potential debris.
Just curious, did that include bleach and water?
Something to that effect, seems to me.
Interesting.
They were squirting that in it, and he hosed it down.
I'd be really interested in that recipe if you could actually get a hold of what that was.
You could probably. Well, I could probably ask that dentist.
Yeah, I think the dentist might have. They might remember what the recipe she said to put together. But if it was bleach and water, it's quite curious that was what she asked you to spray on to sterilize it.
I can't say for sure that's what it was.
That's what she asked Justin to spray on the meat piece as well.
Oh,
that would
was
have ruined the DNA.
Oh.
So that's why I say it'd be interesting to see what that cocktail was that she asked you to spray on that tooth, because she very well may have sabotaged it for you.
Huh?
And that would be a real interesting piece of information to have, Mike. I love you too much to not bring that up and let you put that process through your head.
Yeah,
Find out what that solution was that you sprayed on that.
Well, I'm going to be talking to her.
So let's go back to the tooth, though. We're at the place now that it still hasn't been tested, unfortunately. And, you know, with this being the remaining amount of the tooth, it's going to be difficult.
This is the remaining amount of the tooth.
Oh, this is the cast, that's right.
That's the cast of the tooth.
So we've got about a quarter left and some pulp.
We have enough tooth there that we should get a read.
It very well could be. There's definitely...
If there's DNA there still.
Interesting to have done.
But what I think is hilarious is, you take, you go out in the woods and you find a sample, okay? So you come in with a hair. You stick that hair down in front of somebody on a counter. Then you come over and you sit this tooth down on a counter. How many animals can you eliminate from possibility when you're just looking at a hair, not with a microscope?
Oh, I can't eliminate anything just by looking at the hair.
Thousands of potential animals.
Exactly. Any animal that's on the game list.
But when you look at that tooth, you can eliminate
a lot. I can tell it's not a deer, I can tell it's not a bear, I can tell it's not a cow, I can tell it's not a dog.
Talk about vetting.
Yeah.
You can do visual vetting on a tooth versus a hair, just like that. And yet, in both cases, they didn't check my tooth. They went with hairs instead.
And again, it's a question of that agenda.
I wonder what's going on with DNA science.
I completely understand.
Is DNA science what they say it is? Is this all some facade? Is it a hoax?
Is DNA science a hoax? A question from Mike Rugg at the Bigfoot Discovery Museum.
Can we take the 3 samples that I have, this one, the one Melba has, and the one that Brian Sykes has,
get them all
of them tested and see if they even match?
Exactly. I mean, that's what we're here about today.
That's what I'd like to see happen.
I told you I'd come down and we'd get this interview out, and this is what Mike wants to see happen. Let's see if we can't make it happen. So there's 3 samples out there to be tested. Mike has one in his hand, Melba Ketchum has one in her hand, and Brian Sykes has one in his hand. And damn it, it's time. You people have used us enough. Do something that's right and find out what's in that tooth. Mike, I want to thank you very much for your time here at the Bigfoot Discovery Museum. Reverend Jeff Live coming to you. We'll see you next time. Thanks, buddy.